So let's talk about Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a physician working in Vienna in the 1840s. And he served as chief resident at 2 maternity clinics. And when he arrived, he was perplexed by the significant difference in mortality rates between the 2 clinics. And this fact was well known even outside the hospital, where women would get on their knees begging not to be admitted to the second clinic and choosing to give birth on the street instead. So Semmelweis made it his mission to find out the cause. And he conducted a series of studies comparing the differences between the 2 clinics, comparing procedures and techniques all the way to religious practices. And he found the problem. Physicians at the second clinic were conducting autopsies and carrying contamination from the autopsy room to their patients. So Semmelweis decided to put in a policy where physicians had to wash their hands with a chlorinated solution prior to patient treatment. And within 2 months, the mortality rate at the second clinic dropped to 0. It was fantastic. So when Semmelweis shared his findings with his colleagues, surprisingly, the data was ridiculed, ignored, and flatly rejected. His fellow physicians and even his wife thought he was losing his mind. And in 1865, they had him committed to a mental institution where he died 2 weeks later. It's a shocking story, but I think all of us can relate to it in some way. All of us at some point or another have struggled with trying to convince someone else to change their perspective or belief. Even in business, this happens all the time, where organizations seem to turn a blind eye to the obvious, no matter how many charts or graphs are presented. But why does this happen? Well, back in Semmelweis' time, they didn't have access to the same data and information we do today, so maybe their skepticism is a little more understandable. But today, we produce more data than ever before in our living history. 2.5 quintillion bytes daily. And despite this breadth of information, we continue to cherry pick or avoid data that conflicts with our existing beliefs. I'll give you a more recent example. A company I was working for had a team dedicated to updating and maintaining thousands of product documents. And this was an incredibly tedious process that took actually 5 full-time staff members to maintain year-round. So the team got together and decided to propose a new online system that would centrally manage and universally enable maintenance of all these documents. And the new system was going to reduce the amount of errors in the documents by up to 90%. It was going to diminish the amount of time it took to actually update the documents from hours down to minutes. And in addition, it was going to free up the team's time, almost 80% of their time, for other projects and initiatives. So this was a total slam dunk. However, you know where I'm going, the CEO completely rejected it. He didn't believe the system would produce the results the data claimed. Now, this seems illogical, but in a way it is. We all know that to build a solid business case, we need to have research and data at hand. But many studies have shown that over 90% of our decisions are made based on emotion rather than logic. But we think that with enough information or the right information, we can convince someone to see the flaw in their thinking. The problem is we're overlooking the fundamentals of human behavior, how we process, interpret, and digest new information. We're ignoring the perception gap. You see, each and every one of us have a unique set of experiences, knowledge, and biases that shape our individual perceptions. Our perceptions serve as our sounding board. They allow us to contrast new information with our existing sphere of knowledge to draw familiar conclusions. And we can't easily connect new information to our existing perceptions. We're more likely to reject it. And this behavior makes sense because by sticking to our beliefs, it protects us from every snake oil salesman that comes along with a convincing pitch. Now, today, we know that inadequate hand washing can transmit disease. But back in Semmelweis's time, this wasn't common knowledge. The cause of disease was actually believed to be an imbalance of humors in the body, specifically blood, bile, and phlegm. And this perception was the problem. So while Semmelweis was trying to convince his colleagues with the data, their perception that disease came from within made it almost impossible for them to understand how hand washing could have any effect on a person's health. It didn't matter what the data said. The perception gap was too wide. However, a few decades later, Louis Pasteur proved that germs, not humors, were the primary cause of disease. This discovery helped shrink the perception gap, creating a connection between hygiene and disease and enabling a better understanding of Semmelweis's findings. You see, we often think that when data is ignored or opposed, it's a result of ignorance or a failure to grasp the evidence. But it's a signal of resistance, indicating a perception gap. So instead of doubling down with more data, bigger data, better data, we need to shift our thinking from the technical aspects of perception change, from facts and figures, to cognitive ones. It's not about understanding why someone disagrees, but rather from where. And this is a subtle but important difference. When we ask why someone disagrees, we're thinking data. But when we ask from where they disagree, we're examining perception. It's a mental shift from justification to exploration. Because understanding the where gives us a better view of the source of resistance. So that CEO who rejected that online system idea, he wasn't rejecting the data. His resistance was the signal of a perception gap. He didn't believe that system would work because in his past experience, it hadn't. His perception was that technology was simply added expense and complexity because he didn't understand technology himself. So to shrink the gap, the team had the CEO try out the system itself. This enabled him to understand its simplicity and see how it could benefit the organization. You know, the father of advertising, David Ogilvy, famously said, "We all have a tendency to use data as a drunkard uses a lamppost for support, not illumination." So as we try to gather more and more data to make our case, we're overlooking the most important thing: perception. See, the key to changing minds isn't more data. It's about the better understanding of perception gaps. It's not about proving your point, but learning the person and building rapport. It reminds me of something Abraham Lincoln once said: "I don't like that man. I must get to know him better." And now that we've gotten to know each other better, have your perceptions changed? Did you need a series of well-formed charts, graphs, and statistics? Because we had none of that today. Because changing minds is not about more data. It's about understanding the perception gaps to give the data a fighting chance. Thank you.